Ukraine makes sweeping gains, inflation persists, and is Stacey Abrams being undone by sexism? We'll discuss all this and more on this edition of The Editors. I'm Rich Lowry, and I'm joined as always by the Right Honorable Charles C.W. Cook and the Sage of Authenticity Woods, Jim Garrity. You are, of course, listening to a National Review podcast. Our sponsors this episode are NetChoice and Moink. More about them in due course. If for some reason you're not already following us on a streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. And if you like what you hear here, please consider giving us a glowing 5-star review on iTunes. If you don't like what you hear here, please forget I said anything. So before we start in earnest, let's hear a message from NetChoice, which is a trade organization dedicated to free expression and free enterprise online. Americans rightfully presume that tech companies work to keep our data safe, secure, and private online. And as such, we trust tools like app stores because technology companies work diligently to filter out as many scams and unsecure apps as possible. A bill moving through Congress, the Open App Markets Act, would limit tech's ability to protect us from malicious actors. It would force companies to allow apps in their stores, even if those apps don't meet their security standards, leaving Americans exposed, confused, and vulnerable. American tech companies spend a lot of money and time on research, employees, security protocols, and tools to help minimize online scams and criminal activity from malicious actors on the hunt for private information. Don't let Congress make us vulnerable online. Tell your senator to vote no on the Open App Markets Act. Visit netchoice.org. That's netchoice.org for more information. So Jim Garrity, last week or so, we've had stunning news out of Ukraine. Ukraine had been broadcasting a counteroffensive in the south for quite some time now. It had launched it. The Russians had fortified their forces down there, leaving the north around Kharkiv vulnerable, and the Ukrainians have swept and taken maybe about 1,000 miles back, wiping out Russia's gains since April. What do you make of it?
Rich, I am about 80% thrilled to see the Ukrainians kicking the Russian hiney back towards the border. This is no doubt a dispute between a country that is imperfect but good, that is not the aggressor, that stands for relatively democratic or Western values. Do they have some corruption issues? Yeah, they probably do. Against a out and out malevolent, conquering, there's no moral equivalence here, and the good guys are winning, and that's great. But if you can sense that there's a but coming, there is indeed a but coming. In that, basically, since the very beginning of this, back in February, it was like, oh my goodness, the estimates are that the Russians will be in Kiev in 3 days, and they're going to, stomp all over them, and this thing's going to be over before it starts. And lo and behold, the Ukrainians put up fierce resistance, and they could not take Kiev, and they tried to take the airport, and it didn't go well, and it pretty quickly turned into a bloody, stalemate quagmire, with a little bit of changes. Now it's changing, and we learned the Russian army is not what the Russians thought it was. The whole bunch of their much touted modernization was, ended up in corrupt rat holes, and their technology is not as advanced as they thought it was, and they're not as well equipped, and they're vulnerable to drone attacks, and they're vulnerable to their supply lines are bad. And we all remember those images of the long line of tanks just sitting there, afraid of getting stuck in the mud and all that. So all in all, this has been great to see Russian humiliation. But the Russians deserve to be humiliated. Vladimir Putin deserves to be humiliated. But a humiliated Putin is a desperate Putin. And you kind of have this nagging feeling. We've had this earlier for most of the year, that if things get bad enough for Putin, does he do something even worse in an effort
what would that be?
The one we've been hearing about from no less than CIA Director Burns was the possibility of nuclear weapons. So far, we haven't seen any movement on that front, but there's always that option there. Putin would have the option of doing this on a mountaintop somewhere, so you wouldn't be irradiating some areas that he would someday want to conquer. Or he could actually choose to irradiate some of these areas if he was feeling sufficiently enraged and malevolent enough. You could do it at high altitude and end up having the effect of a widespread electromagnetic pulse. We've already seen from the nuclear plant that the Russians are wildly reckless when it comes to these sorts of things when Ukraine is in the area. And of course, this is in the land of Chernobyl. So there's that. There's biological weapons, there's chemical weapons, there's all kinds of other non-conventional weapons. This sense that the question is, Vladimir Putin went into this fight thinking he was going to be remembered as Vladimir the Great. What happens when he begins to realize he could come out of this remembered as Vladimir the Defeated?
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of think that at that point, he becomes a wounded dog. He becomes really dangerous. I hope, somebody in the Russian chain of command would say, no, we're not nuking Kiev or something like that. But I don't know how much we can count on this because, and one of the things I guess has me really nervous is that you'd like to think that the US, the Biden administration, NATO, all of us have some sort of effort to try to deter some move like this. But then again, they thought they had effective plans to deter an invasion. And we all saw how that shook out.
Yeah, it would present some really challenging problems. I talked to some people about this the other day, and one friend saying probably the red line where you become much more worried about a scenario like that is if the Ukrainians start to take back Crimea. Now they're kind of far from that point. It's not clear, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive might stall out or whether it's just going to sweep to victory. Certainly, it looks harder in the south than in the north because Russians have, again, that's what they have more of their forces there. And another friend said, well, he began to worry about the nuclear scenario if Putin is taken out by some sort of right-wing cabal back at home. And you've had these right-wing figures in Russia and these military bloggers complaining about Putin, but it's very hard to see that he's actually vulnerable to a coup. So, Charlie, my take on this one, I agree with everything Jim said, but it's a testament not just to Ukrainian ingenuity, not just to Ukrainian staying power and morale and will, but just to the sheer effect of weapons. When they were outgunned by the Russians, they were losing and they were getting steadily ground down, losing hundreds of soldiers a day. Then we give them these HIMARS, these really advanced artillery systems that have longer range than the Russian artillery, can hit targets with great precision 50 miles away, that are highly mobile. So you shoot them and then you just scoot away and you're not vulnerable to counterfire. You give them that, and then all of a sudden, the balance of power in the conflict has shifted.
Yeah, I'm unequivocally pleased because, as Jim says, Russia is the aggressor here. And when countries are invaded by aggressors, they should fight back. Ukraine has done that with some help. And I hope they expel the Russians, and anything that flows from that expulsion will be on the Russians' heads, not on the Ukrainians. The part of this that I meditate on is just the sheer waste of human life.
Mm-hmm.
We have so many examples from history of battles or wars that end up in the same place they started. And all that has changed is that there's widespread destruction of property and wealth. And more important, that there is widespread destruction of life, which you can't rebuild. We saw this in the First World War, saw this in Vietnam, and we're seeing it here. I mean, if it is the case, it seems possible that the Russians are pushed back and the Ukrainians have managed somehow to restore the pre-war borders. What will be different? Tens of thousands of human beings will have lost their lives. And I include the Russians in that.
Yeah.
Because
some estimates are 50,000, which is just extraordinary.
Right. And not all of them are Putinists. Maybe the majority aren't. I don't know. A lot of those people, they're victims here too. And it is beyond my comprehension to imagine, but I think it's worth reflecting on, because often, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, when we talk about this sort of thing, we talk in these sweeping terms. The numbers lose their meaning. We talk about places and weapons types and counteroffensives and supply lines. But goodness me, if this ends up where it started, which is the ideal outcome, of course, the costs will have been incalculable.
So, Jim, how do you evaluate Biden's performance in all this? Obviously, there's over optimism about deterring Putin with sanctions, and actually quite limited sanctions compared to what we've actually done now. And then there's back and forth about providing them planes, and the Zelensky and his supporters in the U.S. really had to lobby and fight to get these HIMARS systems there. But overall, Biden's been quite supportive. He did pony up these systems. They've made a big difference, and it looks as though, at least at this juncture, there's a prospect for Ukrainian victory that most of us, certainly speaking for myself, found highly unlikely at the beginning of this conflict.
Rich, I know you moved about a year or two ago, or when you were looking around on, say, Redfin or housing sites. You ever notice some listings would have pictures of the house and they were slightly fuzzy, they were kind of out of focus, and you'd see certain pictures of rooms from only certain angles, but not other ones that you had a hard time. That's what Biden's record on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you don't look at it from a certain angle, it looks good. If you're a little out of focus, at first glance, it looks good. He says all the right things. Yeah, sometimes he goes off message and says we'd be okay with a limited incursion, or for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. The back and forth on the planes is kind of annoying because, like, after they said, no, we're not letting our Eastern European NATO allies send them MiG-29s, then later on, the administration, well, maybe we will. And then apparently, last I heard was, no, we're not going to. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, it almost seems to have gotten completely forgotten, was back in early August. Tom Friedman, in between talking to cab drivers, mentioned that the White House had said privately, U.S. officials are a lot more concerned about Ukraine's leadership than they're letting on. There is deep mistrust between the White House and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, considerably more than has been reported. And there's funny business going on in Kiev, talked about corruption and stuff like that. And I looked at that, I was like, one of two things are happening, right? Either the White House just wants this war to end and just kind of wants, Zelensky to reach a deal, and he's not playing ball, so they're getting ready to cut him loose. Or whatever, this is very clear. Somebody was talking to Tom Friedman to get ready to dump on Zelensky. And now the Ukrainians are gaining. So I strongly suspect you will see Joe Biden running out to do a victory lap and taking credit for the victory. Now, look, obviously, U.S. weapons exports did have a very big impact on this. But the administration has had these two competing impulses. One, we want Ukraine to win. And two, we'd prefer if the war wasn't fought at all. And sooner or later, those two goals get into conflict. And I think you see this in Biden flipping back and forth and what kind of tone he's taking from day to day. I don't think this has been clear leadership. I think it's been confused and muddled. But then again, Joe Biden's kind of a confused and muddled kind of guy.
Charlie Cook, X question to you. Ukraine will win the war. Yes or no?
Yes.
Jim Garrity.
It depends on how you define win, but yes, I think by most standards, it will have won the war when all is said and done.
I'm going to go with a Weasley. I don't really know. I'm going to say Ukraine's not going to lose and Russia is not going to win. With that cryptic answer, let's go to Charlie for a Moink read.
Did you know that 60% of U.S. pork production comes from one company owned by the Chinese? And their hogs are given something called ractopamine, which is banned in 160 countries, including China.
Wow. Did you just say that correctly, Charlie?
I hope so.
That's impressive. If I had known that word was in there, that I would have given you the Moink read just for that reason.
Well, I tell you what, anyone who wants to hear me say it again can write to me privately. I'll send you an audio recording. And Rich, that's open to you as well. It's an offer. Anyhow, ractopamine is banned in 160 countries, including China. Yet you will find it in your grocery aisle every day. But there is a better way. I'd like to tell you about Moink. That's moo plus oink. Moink. Moink, which I subscribe to, as does Sarah Shitty, I know, delivers grass-fed and grass-finished beef and lamb, pastured pork and chicken, and sustainable wild-caught Alaskan salmon straight to your door. Moink farmers farm like our grandparents did. And as a result, Moink meat tastes like it should because the family farm does it better. The Moink difference is a difference you can taste, and you can feel good knowing you're helping family farms stay financially independent too. You choose the meat delivered in every box, ribeyes, chicken breasts, pork chops, salmon fillets, and much more. And you can cancel at any time, but of course you won't want to. Actually, Sarah and I often exchange Moink stories, what we're cooking this week. My kids don't know it, of course, because it's what they're used to now. But they notice when they go to other places that the meat's just not quite as good. And they sort of tell us surreptitiously. When they grow up, I'll explain why. The Moink difference was obvious from the beginning to Shark Tank host Kevin O'Leary, who called the bacon they serve the best bacon he's ever tasted. It was also obvious to Ring Doorbell founder Jamie Siminoff, who jumped at the chance to invest in Moink. So if you want to keep American farming going, you can sign up at moinkbox.com/editors right now. And listeners of this show will get free filet mignon in every order for a year. That's 1 year of the best filet mignon you'll ever taste. But that offer is only available for a limited time. So get on it now. That's moinkbox.com/editors. moinkbox.com, moinkbox.com/editors.
Thanks so much, Charlie. So, Jim, let's go to you first again. Inflation report, discouraging. Number is still high, even though gas prices have abated somewhat. 8.3 annual rate here. Jason Furman, who is a must follow on this kind of stuff, asks, where's the inflation coming from? He points out that you can point to lots of things in any given month. Airfares have been up and down, used cars prices have been up and down, but the constants are extremely tight labor market and high short-run inflation expectations. So he says anyone who's grappling with this problem and thinking about it has to reckon with a large chunk of excess inflation that is not some special factor.
So, Rich, the last consumer price index report came out when I was on vacation, and I was keeping one eye on it, checking the news. And this is the one where it had gone down from the, previous 40-year high, from the abysmal, oh my God, it's above 9%, to the more moderate, it's about 8.5%. And somehow it seemed Joe Biden managed to Jedi mind trick, if not the whole country, then certainly every like-minded reporter to say this meant there was zero inflation. And of course, it all depends on whether you're measuring month to month and whether you're measuring year to year. Needless to say, 8.5% year over year in any other circumstance is still really, really bad. All it means is that it's slightly less horribly bad than the previous month. And yet somehow he just kind of seems to say 0%, 0%, 0%. The Biden cadence is to yell, then to whisper, then to yell. And that, I was like, people are really going to buy into that? But what was fascinating was how much, not only did everybody, and a lot of folks in the media march in lockstep, how much Democratic candidates and Democratic lawmakers seemed to act as if this meant, okay, inflation is fixed. Mm-hmm. And while this was all going on, gas prices were indeed dropping from that mid-June super duper high, $5 a gallon nationally, $6 a gallon in a whole bunch of states, and you could find it at $7 a gallon. And gas prices are down. One of the things I don't think Democrats think about these issues the way most people do. I checked it this morning. Right now in AAA, it says the national average is $3.70. That's bad. That's not as bad as it was in mid-June. Yeah, it's better than the $5 a gallon, but $3.70 isn't cheap. And in my neck of the woods, it's saying, I guess right now the average in Virginia is $3.46, which is less. I was paying more than that last time I filled up my tank. That's not good price. I'm not going to the I'm saying, oh well, it's not as bad as it was in midsummer, but it's not good. And oh, by the way, we're now into mid-September. Summer vacations are over. People aren't going on long road trips. The kids are back in school. Demand is down, so gas shouldn't be high. And so there's but there's some bad numbers coming out of OPEC and stuff like that. So I would not sleep on gas prices. still being an issue between now and the midterm elections. I don't think people feel, good, okay, gas prices are normal. No, they're not normal at all. What probably has people freaking out about this number come out earlier this morning is the sense that, well, actually, gas prices are not what's driving it, and it's everywhere else that seems to be really bad.
Just food and shelter.
Yeah, who needs that? But I would say to people, because you see, inflation easing, you see all those headlines. Just look at your grocery bill. I guess one of the things I kind of keep coming back to is that, like, I don't know, how often listeners shop for groceries, shop for gas, stuff like that. But you got to make either a rent or a mortgage payment once a month, right? So if that's going up. Your grocery bills, we usually shop like the plan is to shop once a week, and then we find out we forgot something, so we inevitably end up going back. And you just know what a normal bag of groceries is, and you just see it increasing. Now, maybe you haven't felt like your heart jumping out of your chest or your eyeballs looking like ping pong balls as you look at the final cost, but it doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel normal. Now you're just like, okay, it's as bad as it usually is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of that is a formula to make people happy about the state of the country. Is it on the right direction? Do you feel good about President Biden? Do you feel good about Democrats controlling Congress? I think inflation is going to be front and center, certainly for the next couple of days in most campaigns. I think Republicans will be beating the drums on this. And what's more, there's one more consumer price index report coming out in mid-October. I think that will make it an issue, big, front and center again. And the thing that I also note is that Joe Biden has a lot of bad habits, and this administration has a lot of bad habits, but they have this really bad one that means they tend to spike the football in victory at the slightest sign of an improvement, at the slightest sign things are getting better. And so, yeah, you could say last month's inflation report, because it wasn't the worst in 40 years, represented a very mild improvement. And then Biden's running around acting like he'd won the war. And I think Democrats don't realize how much inflation and gas prices, and if this reported train strike goes forward, we have supply chain issues coming back. They're really whistling past the graveyard and convincing themselves people think the economy is doing great, and I really don't think they do.
Mm-hmm. Gas prices obviously is still elevated. I do have to say there is a bit of a psychological threshold getting beneath 4 when you've been at 5. So just $3.70 or so, which it is around where I am. It does it's still high, but it feels as though you've taken a really good measurable step down. But Charlie, we were talking before we started recording. You were watching the Broncos Seahawks last night, and Domino's Pizza had these ads that were their theme was how to deal with higher prices and higher gas prices, and how Domino's was adjusting to serve their customers in these new inflationary circumstances. So that's kind of as mainstream as you get. That's not a political party hitting it. That's the greatest pizza outfit in America hitting it.
I'll ignore that part of your question. The problem that Biden has is that this is one of those issues, as we've noted before, that you cannot rhetoric your way out of. You can't media bias your way out of it. You can't sin of omission your way out of it. You just have to deal with it. And he doesn't want to. He's bored by inflation. This is an irritant for him. And so he, like Trump, on a number of issues that face the country, is just sort of pretending it didn't happen. Hurry up. COVID's over. And then you watch TV and you get the voiceover that says, how everything's terrible and gas is expensive and everything's more expensive than it was before. So I agree with Jim. I think this is going to keep hurting them. I think that their tendency to claim victory is counterproductive. I would just add something else here, though. And that is that although it seems that inflation is improving over time, it's still pretty bad. But although it seems that it's improving, and yes, gas prices have come down, maybe that's because supply is higher, maybe we're releasing a lot of strategic petroleum reserve and so on. There are mechanisms that have been used to effect those changes. And those mechanisms or causes are in and of themselves a threat to the Democrats. This is the problem when you get into this situation. This is why people dread inflation. This is why the late 1970s and early 80s were so difficult for governments, because you can't press a button and make it go away. So what is it that has changed in the last 6 months? Interest rates, for one. I already own my house, thank goodness. People who are going in to the housing market now are paying on average 6% interest on their mortgage. A year ago, that was 2.5%. That's going to help bring down inflation, but it's not good if you're borrowing money or you're looking to buy a house or you're buying a new car. Likewise, we had 2 back-to-back quarters of negative growth. Now, we can haggle over the specific technical term of recession, but that's not good. Yes, it might help bring inflation down, but that is not what you want as a country. You want 3-4% growth. So, I think Democrats and Joe Biden in particular, they're going to pay a price for this on both ends. They're going to pay a price for it having happened in the first place, and then they're going to pay a price for it being fixed, because the medicine tastes really, really bad. And where Joe Biden is in a different position than was, say, Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, is that he will expect to be thanked for having got rid of or diminished a problem that the majority of voters blame him and his party for in the first place. And that wasn't true of Reagan, and it wasn't true of Thatcher. The analogy I always draw is with Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. When Winston Churchill came into office in 1940, he quite quickly had to ask a great deal of the British public. He had the Blitz, turn off your lights, send your sons to the front, ration.
Send your kids to the
your food.
countryside.
Well, yeah, exactly. But no one blamed Churchill for the predicament that Britain found itself in. And so they were willing to cut him some slack. The same was true of Reagan. I mean, Reagan really did actually suffer a great deal politically in the first couple of years. I mean, look at the 1982 midterms, look at his approval rating. It's pretty awful.
Yeah, because he took the recession to kill inflation.
Right, but he knew that. And so what he got blamed for was the recession that killed inflation. He didn't get blamed for inflation and then the recession that it took to kill the inflation that people blamed him for having caused. And I think Biden is at risk here. Whether this affects the midterms, whether it's compensated for by other issues in the midterms, I don't know. But Biden has a problem because he's going to have to take decisions, or at least decisions are going to have to be taken by the Federal Reserve that are intended to mitigate an issue that people lay at his feet, partly fairly, partly unfairly. And that's the bit that I think is being ignored. At what point do people stop saying, wow, look at the price of milk, and start saying, wow, look at the cost of borrowing money? Because that's going to be an issue for a year or so to come. And it's really, really difficult to contend with, especially if you're a first-time home buyer.
So, Jim, the other big issue here, we got these issues in competition, right? Republicans want to talk about inflation. Democrats want to talk about abortion. And Democrats have had much greater success making the midterms about abortion than I would have thought. And you finally have Republicans kind of realizing they need to get much shrewder on abortion. They can't just mumble and look at their shoes, and they can't have the maximalist positions that they had when this really wasn't a live political issue, at least not the way it is now in the post-Roe environment. And you have word Lindsey Graham is working on this proposal in the Senate for a 15-week ban that I think would be a really good rallying point for Republicans. You get majority support for restrictions are right around there, 15, 20 weeks, not all that pro-lifers would want, but it should be a position that lets Republicans plant their feet and then shoot at the other side as extremists. And Republicans are losing on this issue. There's a new NBC poll that says 51-32 battleground state voters say Republicans are more extreme on abortion than Democrats. That's not true, and Republicans have the opportunity. It's not going to be easy, but have the opportunity to demonstrate to voters that it's not true if they get unified around a compromise position and then point out that the other side supports abortion for all nine months with federal funding.
No, I completely agree with that assessment. It's been frustrating and infuriating to see Republicans so slow-footed, so tentative, so almost afraid to say what they think. And I guess the fear is they see it as a no-win situation, in that if they say, well, we want to reduce abortions towards the end of the pregnancy, but not all of them at once, well, then they'll upset pro-lifers. And also the people who are adamantly pro-choice, they're super fired up and motivated and all that stuff. Well, the end result is the ninny who wants to ban contraception in some state level race out in the middle of nowhere is outspoken about this. And then that turns into the Republican voice on this issue. If if you're a Republican and you're not talking about the issue of abortion, then somebody else is going to speak for you, and other people are going to try to paint you and say what you believe instead of you saying what you believe. So no, you cannot dodge this. You cannot run from this. You cannot be Blake Masters and pretend that your campaign issue part of your website is an Etch-a-Sketch. And if you pick it up and shake it, it'll, the answers will go away and you can just put stuff there. I mean, we've had a lot of disappointing Republican candidates this cycle. That move struck me as just utterly inexcusable. And it's a good reason it set off the fight in the corner that it did. Say what you believe, stand for, be clear about what you believe and say. And if you say pro-lifers, fully committed pro-lifers are like, hey, we expected after Roe versus Wade fell that all abortions would end. You can say, well, that was never a realistic expectation. We are in a country with 50 different states with 50 different viewpoints on abortion. And we're going to start with the most controversial, least justifiable, least understandable, we're going to leave exceptions for rape and incest. We're going to, take care of the ones that are really hard cases because we know those are a small minority of these abortions. We're going to focus on the ones that there's the broadest consensus are not consistent with American values. Go with that and see how that goes for you. Because right now, staying silent isn't getting you anywhere.
So, Charlie Cook, what will be the most important issue in the midterms, inflation or abortion?
Inflation. That's not to say abortion won't matter, but I think that the abortion debate will be more localized, whereas inflation is a national question. And these are elections for Congress, which is a national body. I know a lot of states have elections too, but I think that we are still in the late summer phase, and when Republicans start running ad after ad after ad talking about the economy, I think it will increase in importance and salience and have more of an effect than anything else.
Jim Garrity.
I largely agree with Charlie's assessment. The only thing I just add is that, you get reminded about inflation every time you buy something. Groceries, gas, God help you if you're trying to buy a house right now. Trying to make any home improvements. You go to Lowe's, you're like, God, I might as well make my addition out of plutonium instead of lumber.
This is why just you got to adapt my policy and never make any home improvement.
I keep trying to make that argument, but never seem to finish.
I agree with you guys. I think inflation has much broader consequence and is felt by literally everyone. Doesn't mean that abortion isn't going to be important. I think there might have been a poll at some point last several weeks that showed more people said they cared about abortion. It's hard to believe, but just shows how much progress Democrats have made highlighting that issue. But I can't believe that's going to be sustained. I'm looking at an NPR poll just from a couple of days ago that has inflation at 30 and abortion at 22. That feels about right. And if you get another bad inflation report. The inflation number had abated a little bit in this NPR poll, but I think you could see it bump up again. So I'm pretty confident in agreeing with you guys, which isn't always the case, that it absolutely will be inflation. With that, let me pause and do a quick plug for NR Plus digital subscription service at nationalreview.com. Your way around our metered paywall. That metered paywall is increasingly extensive. It's hardened. We have the best people in the business working to make it impossible to invade our metered paywall. They have not yet quite succeeded. So there are ways around it, but you should feel a little guilty if you're trying to dance around our metered paywall with different devices and different browsers and all that. Why are you doing that to us? Why are you in effect cheating us? You should become an honest reader and just pay up. Not a lot. Doesn't cost a lot. We have great first-time deals at any given moment. Once you sign up and log in, the ads disappear. It's like magic. Not all of them. You'll still see a few, but the most annoying and obnoxious ones. And I'm sorry, I hear complaints about this all the time. It's understandable. We only do it because we do have to pay the bills other ways besides just NR Plus signups. But once someone signed up for NR Plus, we consider them good, and we don't need to try to make any more revenue off of them through those ads. So they disappear. They just go away. So it's a much better reading experience. And not everyone wants to do this, but if you want to comment on articles and blog posts, it's only NR Plus members in there. There's a robust commenting community, hundreds and hundreds of comments on a lot of articles and blog posts. You can also be part of our private Facebook group and be invited to special events and calls. Charlie and MBD and I just did a pretty intimate NR Plus call with about 80 people who, the first to respond to an invitation, and really just informal chat. And that's small enough where people can ask questions and make comments directly. We have a meetup coming up out on the West Coast. You'll hear more about that if you're lucky enough to be in the area. You should be getting an email if you already signed up for NR Plus. Anyway, so it's a great deal all around. And then just last and most importantly is the best way to support our journalism, if you consider it valuable, which you probably do. If you're reading us, if you're listening to this podcast, please help support it by signing up for NR Plus. So Charlie, on Friday's EP, we had an extra question about whether AOC will run for president. Let's dig in a little bit more on this big profile of AOC. And there's also a similar piece out in the New York Times about Stacey Abrams. AOC says, could be a major problem for her prospective presidential campaign, all the racism and sexism that would hold her back. What do you make of it?
I don't think that AOC's problem is the outside world. I think AOC's problem is AOC. I think AOC is a self-indulgent mediocrity. And I think that the press has pumped her up and she can't sustain the attention, and she doesn't belong on the pedestal. Yeah,
just imagine, say she was just an average dude. She wouldn't be getting magazine covers. It's ridiculous that somehow her political career has been hurt by the fact that she's a woman.
Yes, and of course the piece that occasioned the most recent round of talk about AOC was its profile in GQ by Wesley Lowery, which, as you say, she wouldn't have received if she were an average dude. The idea that she puts forward in it, and he echoes, that she is treated unfairly is completely inverted. She's not treated unfairly. She is treated incredibly well. She says stupid things, she gets away with it. She says, well, I hesitate to use the word offensive, but certainly outre things that anyone else would be crucified for. For example, in that profile, she says that when her, I believe now fiance, suggested to her that this year coming, this was a while back, he might like to get engaged to her. She said, well, I don't know about that. You'll have to woo me. Nothing wrong with that per se. And then Wesley Lowery says that she told him that she wasn't sure whether a mixed race marriage would be right for her. Now, anyone else, irrespective of their motivation, who said that in an interview in a major magazine would be hounded and called upon to explain it. When we say as a country that we are supportive of interracial marriages, we don't mean for other people. That's not what the question implies. So let's just suppose for a moment that Marco Rubio says, well, sure, I'm in favor of interracial marriage. I just don't know if it would be right for me. Suppose Glenn Youngkin in Virginia had said that in an interview, or Tim Scott. What do you think the response would have been? I mean, it's all we would have heard about. And of course, no one cares when it's her. And it's in fact more than that. It's cast in this light of, it raises complex questions around identity and belonging in a modern America. Yeah, it does when it's AOC. And I think this is true of almost everything that she says. I think she has cut the most remarkable amount of slack. And you know, as I wrote in a corner post on this, I think that her conclusions about herself are just wrong. You know, she says that America probably wouldn't let her be president, which might be true. But it's not because she's a woman. It's not because she has slightly darker skin than most people. It's because she's a mediocre socialist. I don't think the country's going to let Marjorie Taylor Greene be president either. That doesn't say anything ill of the voters. She says that her agenda would probably stall out in the Senate. Well, yeah, because the Senate's elected. And what she stands for is not popular. I mean, we're talking about someone here, remember, who is one of 435 people who has been, as she notes, again with a slightly whiny tone, kept at arm's length by her own party because she's a liability, who won her seat in a safe democratic environment because she prevailed in a primary election in which, 10,000 people took part? And she has these delusions of grandeur. And when she thinks through what it might look like if she were to run for president or try to enact her radical agenda, she can only blame the system or these amorphous pressures on her for her assumed failure rather than herself. And I think that's the core of her problem, is that she has not realized and perhaps can't realize that she has been given a totally unrealistic expectation of her agenda and of her own abilities by a media that has elevated her beyond her station.
So, Jim, let's go to this New York Times article about Stacey Abrams. Turns out that Raphael Warnock is running persistently ahead of Herschel Walker, and Stacey Abrams is running persistently behind Brian Kemp. And it's hard to blame this on another of the go-to excuses, racism, because Warnock is an African-American and is ahead of another African-American. And Abrams is African-American who just happens to be losing. So they go to sexism. And so Democrats are fretting that she, as an African-American woman running for an executive office, is just getting trouble with her traction when, everything up to this point, we have been told that Stacey Abrams is like a world-conquering political genius, right? She was responsible single-handedly, supposedly, for Georgia's turning blue, or at least becoming bluish, or becoming a swing state. And her registration efforts did have a major effect I believe, but that doesn't necessarily make her a particularly compelling politician. And one reason Warnock might be running ahead of her is Warnock is an incumbent running against a weak Republican in Herschel Walker, whereas Stacey Abrams is a challenger running against an entrenched and really competent and impressive incumbent in Brian Kemp. Plus, Raphael Warnock is a pastor, and although he's a real lefty, that just has a more moderate, down-to-earth feel, where Stacey Abrams is a professional left-wing political activist.
Rich, the only point in there I'm going to push back or dispute slightly is that the last 3 polls in Georgia have Herschel Walker with a small lead. 1 point, 2 point, 3 point. I'm not saying this are, huge deal, but it's looking a little bit better for Herschel Walker.
Yeah. And I should say, I don't discount Herschel at all.
Yeah. It's, it looks like it's going to be a jump ball. And if you're the challenger, that's pretty good, not a bad spot to be in, considering Herschel Walker may not be the most articulate candidate out there. But yeah, so the New York Times writes this story noting this contrast here, that Warnock is, certainly playing it close and certainly has a decent shot at reelection. And that does not appear to be the case for Abrams versus Kemp. And in fact, Kemp, they say that, Kemp's average is 5%, which is accurate, but you can find polls that have, Abrams down more. And it, there really hasn't been any reason to think that this is going to be anything different. It doesn't look like it's going to be a single digit, close race. For what it's worth, the last Fox 5 Insider Advantage had Kemp up by 50% to 42%. So what's going on, right? You've got a hard fought Senate race and a hard fought governor's race. Why is one Democrat doing better than the other? 2 quotes in this article jumped out at me. The first was from Stacey Abrams herself saying, quote, "I imagine an electorate that is possible, not the electorate as if the election was held today." Now, you can always, the standard joke, if the election was held today, people would be confused because they think it's in November. But, will the makeup of the electorate change a great deal from mid-September to early November? Probably not. I don't think, you can run ads, you can have debates, things can happen. But by and large, the people who are really interested in voting in the election now are probably going to be the same people who are going to be really interested in voting the election a few weeks from now. So it's really not that much time left. It's really not that much. The electorate's not going to have that much churn or change. And I'm sure it makes Stacey Abrams feel good to know that she can imagine an electorate she's winning in. But here in the real world, she's behind pretty consistently, and that's not great. You'd like to think you'd have a backup plan to win against actual flesh and blood human beings and not the imaginary ones that's there.
It's not crazy, right, Jim, to really effective candidates do change the electorate. Like Trump changed the electorate in 2016, but Warnock has what looks to be a more realistic strategy of trying to be appealing enough to some moderate Republicans and independents to win the electorate pretty much as it is. As you say now, it's probably not changing radically come November. So,
well, the other thing,
yeah.
I also got to jump in here because it says, the New York Times credits her for the turnout operation that helped carry the state for Biden, Warnock, and Ossoff. Well, let's not forget, Donald Trump was insisting that the state's election had been stolen from him. Sidney Powell was saying that Venezuelan hackers had altered the votes, and Lynn Wood was out there telling people not to vote because the elections are all hacked anyway. Mm-hmm. That seems like a really unusual set of circumstances that might have played a factor in Ossoff and Warnock winning in the runoff. So I think this turnout operation can be overcredited.
I would also point out, and I want to be very clear here, Georgia's election system is the way that it is. The election was conducted fairly, and the winners were the winners. But that if you add up the Ossoff-Perdue tallies across 2 dates, because there were 2 plebiscites, Perdue got more votes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't know to what extent Georgia has shifted in the way Stacey Abrams assumes. Yeah,
but just that that Biden could win,
and Biden won.
Yeah, it would have been pretty hard to imagine from the perspective of several years ago. And it's not all Stacey Abrams. The state has been changing, becoming more suburban. But Jim, just that name, Lynn Wood, it goes back to just the lunacy of that post-election period, that there was a period in there, at least for several weeks or a couple months, where Lynn Wood was a big deal. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
He was last talking 9/11 trutherism at some rally last I heard, after a short-lived bid for South Carolina State Republican Party chairman that I and anybody else who paid attention to South Carolina State Republican politics would say, nah, he's got no chance at this. And that a whole bunch of people treated fairly credibly because he was a wacko and he says wacko things. And a lot of people in the media love to spotlight so-called Republicans who say wacko things. The other quote, by the way, in that New York Times article that
you just can't stop in this New York Times article.
I know you want to move on, but this is like the second statement was, quote, Ms. Abrams' allies said the comparisons between her and Ms. Warnock overlooked stark differences. Now, they do mention, she's taking on an incumbent governor. Yes, I think that's the best, explanation. And if I were her campaign looking for reasons for why she's trailing, that's what I would lead into. Instead, Ms. Abrams is a Black woman contending with sexist stereotypes about leadership, they note. This sounds like a preemptive excuse to me. Right now, in today's Morning Jolt, I lay out about how Stacey Abrams is literally compared to a superhero. She posed in a cape and with smoke for a Washington Post photo op, right? Mark Ruffalo says she's on magazine covers. She's the superstar. If you turn around and say, well, it just turns out that our state is just too sexist to elect a woman. Then you're a superstar. You're a superhero. You're supposed to be able to overcome it.
Turns out you're a victim.
I will bet a donut that on election day 2022, when all the votes are counted, when you put up the exit polls, Georgia will have had more women voters than male voters. That's what happened in 2018, and that's what happened in 2020. You're telling me an electorate with more women's voting than men voting is biased against women?
But that you are once again,
self-hating women. Yeah.
The internalized misogyny and racism of the electorate has escaped your attention.
So, by the way, Jim, another thing about this New York Times article that was kind of funny. It was the reporter or one of the reporters asked Warnock, so you campaigning with Stacey Abrams? Like, no, we're focusing on our own campaign. It's a classic, an unpopular president's coming in. You don't want to have anything to do with him. But apparently they campaigned together the next day, perhaps in response to this question. But just final thing before we let this go. Brian Kemp is a really impressive politician. He came into the office a couple months ago before the primary. And, he's not like a dynamic talker, but man, he has a record to brag about. He's been through the ringer. Trump obviously shooting at him with a bazooka and missed, and Kemp just stomped Purdue. Kemp did the right thing in the election. And after the election in 2020, repeatedly told Trump, I don't have these powers, sorry, go away. Then wins the primary against the Trump-supported alternative, and then is going to win the general against Stacey Abrams again. So it's really an impressive achievement, one he should be proud of. So Charlie, let's do a ranking exit question. We haven't had a ranking exit question in a while. So let's take five potential Democratic, five Democratic figures, let's call them. Stacey Abrams, AOC, Pete Buttigieg, Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris. Rank them in terms of likelihood from 1 to 5, 1 most likely. Likelihood of one day being president of the United States. Stacey Abrams, AOC, Pete Buttigieg, Gavin Newsom, and Kamala Harris, who, by the way, had a doozy of a Meet the Press interview.
Gavin Newsom's the most likely. Kamala Harris is the second most likely. Now, that may shock you, but it's just that she's vice president already. So that's why. If she weren't, I would put her at the bottom.
Really?
Followed, yeah. Next, we'll have Stacey Abrams, and then we'll have AOC, and then we'll have Pete Buttigieg.
Interesting. So you think AOC would be likelier to win a nomination than Buttigieg, and that's the first step?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I for example, I think that, obviously she's from there, but so Stacey Abrams is going to lose, I think, in Georgia, but I don't think she's going to lose by, 15 points.
Mm-hmm.
But I think AOC would lose quite badly in a similar situation. I may be totally wrong. And I know, for example, John McCormack has said that she has star power. Maybe she does. Maybe that's all that matters.
That,
but
that who? That Abrams or AOC?
AOC, sorry,
Yeah.
has star power. But I think that AOC's appeal is quite limited.
Yeah. All right. So that's interesting. Team Garrity. Interesting
I will
rankings.
rank it pretty differently than Charlie. Top of my list is Harris. She could become president tomorrow.
Yeah, that's why I have her top as well. I obviously have no use for her as a politician, but she could be an incumbent president of the United States.
I don't think if for some reason Biden says my health is failing and I can't run for another term, I think Harris is still the most likely Democratic nominee in 2024. I don't think it's certain. I think Newsom would give her a hard run, and who knows how that shakes out. I put Newsom number 2. And then amongst the remaining 3, I think there's a significant drop. I'm going to go with Buttigieg because there was that. He's got the gift. He can do it well on television. I mean, yes, he looks like Alfred E. Newman. Yes, he's short, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, he managed to botch, life at the Department of Transportation the one time people needed to pay attention to the Department of Transportation. But he's still, by and large, a gifted politician, can think on his feet, et cetera, et cetera. He's, younger gay Bill Clinton.
No, he's not.
Just what we need.
He's gay and young. He's just not Bill Clinton.
Well, I mean, I imagine he'd be nice to be in. And then between the two, I think I'd put Abrams over AOC. I think Abrams, as I was doing research for today's Jolt, Abrams was actually fairly well liked amongst Georgia House Republicans back when she was House Minority Leader.
Right.
Which is kind of unusual. It's not the image that has gotten her there. And in fact, I make the argument today, what made her famous, what made her a Democratic Party superstar, was alleging that the election had been stolen and the voting machines had erased votes for her. Oh, does that sound familiar? Right. But anyway, so the irony is that, one of the, I looked at her, I looked at Beto, and I looked at Charlie Crist, and what makes these people famous is not what they did in office. Democrats don't really care about that. What made them famous is that they came close to beating Republicans that Democrats hate. And that's what turns you into a star in Democratic circles.
I think she used to be pro-life. Stacey Abrams.
I didn't know that. So I'm going to go with Kamala first. And I should say what I was thinking when I asked this is elected, most likely to be elected. So I think there's a chance she's incumbent president, and then she has like a, close to 50% chance in 24. Then Gavin, and I agree with Jim, and I assume with Charlie also. Then you get the drop. I go Buttigieg, number 3, Abrams number 4, because maybe there's a miracle and Abrams wins in November, and then that's a big boost. But I think she probably loses, but still, AOC, I would she would have some likelihood of winning a Democratic nomination, but she's so light. She's so far left. I just can't see any chance of her winning a general election. So I'm Kamala 1, Gavin 2, Pete 3, Abrams 4, AOC 5. Write it down, people. Let's keep that one for a couple of years, and we'll see who was right. With that, let's hit a few other things before we go. Jim, you've been watching The Offer, a documentary about the making of The Godfather.
Yeah, one of the problems with this era of allegedly golden television, and having not just, people don't really watch, regular network television that much, but the cable networks, the premium cable networks, the streaming services, is that you can discover a show. I'm like, wow, this is a really good show. And like everybody I know who actually watched it midsummer when it came out. And so you have to, I can't really talk about it with people because of spoilers. I am 6 episodes into this, and it is a docudrama, and I've seen some people contending that it's exaggerated or stretched, about the making of the film The Godfather. And if this portrayal is accurate, just about everything conceivable that could go wrong behind the scenes did go wrong. Studio fights over the script, fights over getting casting, and it has this really eclectic, oh, hey, I know that guy, cast of characters playing, Martin Scorsese and a young Alan Pacino, and the studio heads and the heads of the businesses and all that stuff. The actual mob apparently had very strong thoughts on the making of the film. It's just fun, delightful series where, kind of each episode, there's a sense of what can go wrong and how is our character going to get out of it. I also noticed a little bit of it, like the theme of a of a heist film. Your producer, who totally believes in this film, is collecting his eclectic team of specialists. He finds his producer. He finds his director. He finds his screenwriter. He finds his ally in the studio system. He finds his leading man. And bit by bit, the team is coming together. And the great irony is how much suspense I'm feeling where I know how it ends. The Godfather film gets made and it's a hit. I shouldn't be this at the edge of my seat for all this. And yet they do a really good job of thinking, oh my God, how could this film ever come back from this giant mess up? So really enjoyable. Check it out.
So is there a good documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now? Am I making that up?
Not that I'm familiar with that, yeah.
All right, I'll look that up afterwards. Charlie Cook, you've been watching football.
I suppose I had forgotten just the intensity and range of the emotions football inspires in me. And yes, I suppose that's partly because I'm a Jaguars fan. But this time, although they weren't great, they really could have won the game. And they didn't win the game. They blew it. They missed a field goal. They dropped the ball in the end zone. They missed a 2-point conversion. I mean, I'm less upset about that one, but still. And I don't get like this watching any other sport. I don't know what it is about football. It's just an intensity there. You know, I said afterwards to my wife, I've been looking forward to this for 6 months and now I feel just absolutely rotten. Why was I looking forward to this again? I'm a wreck. This is sweating watching it. But I guess that is the sign of a great sport, is that it can do that to you. It just does it to me, and I suppose Jim as a Jets fan more than most.
Yeah, I had a tough Sunday too. The Titans lost to the Giants. They were winning 20-13 late. They just needed to stop, one Giants drive. They couldn't do it. Giants score what you think was going to be the tying touchdown instead, an incredible gutsy call, but I guess a call it kind of makes sense if you're the Giants and probably headed to, kind of 7-win season. You don't have much to lose. Went for 2 with the shuffle pass, kind of a gutsy play call, and then Barkley, who just had an incredible game, sort of had the kind of a Derrick Henry-esque game, even though Derrick Henry didn't really have a Derrick Henry-esque game. He's hit behind the line of scrimmage, still gets in. Giants go up 21-20. Titans drive within field goal range and miss it. And it's just like, Charlie, I don't know, that's that feeling, you get that sick feeling in your stomach, and then like hours later, it's still there. It's just the first game of the season. So,
well, you also lost in late and difficult circumstances and by 1 point. So that's a particular sick feeling. Another sick feeling is when there's 7 minutes to go and like a chess match, you could sort of see the rest of the game unfolding and you just know what's going to happen, but you have to sit through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you end up being right. That was my sick feeling. Yours was much sharper, I imagine.
The feeling?
Yeah, I think it's a dull sense of inevitability when you watch it slipping away over time compared to when, in the last 2 minutes of the game, you lose a squeaker.
Yeah. It's time for editor's picks, by the way. Jim Garrity, what's your pick?
So I could pick Dan McLaughlin just about every week. And a lot of us at National Review have pointed out that ever since Dark Biden's speech, the term ultra MAGA and quasi-fascist or semi-fascist, that basically Biden begins extending this to just about every Republican. But I think Dan did a really good point where he pointed out ultra MAGA now means Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, because Joe Biden had tweeted out that the ultra MAGA agenda is threatening Social Security and Medicare. Now remember, Donald Trump did not want to touch entitlements at all. Raise taxes on working families, because we all know how much Republicans love raising taxes, and giving big corporations and billionaires tax breaks. And what makes Dan different is that he remembered going back to that debate with Paul Ryan back in 2012. This was the exact same Biden argument. This was the exact same thing. So in the end, Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney and Donald Trump, probably at the two farthest apart, ends of the Republican spectrum, two guys with nothing in common. Biden's making the same argument. So in the end, if you want people to believe that they're MAGA, say that standard issue Republicanism is MAGA. And then I think a lot of people are going to say, well, I guess I'm MAGA.
Charlie Cook, what's your pick?
My pick is by Mark Sidwell, and it is a look back at Milton Friedman's famous essay, "The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits." And it reminds me that there is nothing new under the sun. This essay was written by Friedman in 1970, and it warns corporate executives against trying to bring about social change rather than make money. Really, it could have been written yesterday.
So my pick is Jim Garrity's piece, "The Democrats' Empty Celebrity Candidates," hitting Charlie Crist, Beto, and Stacey Abrams. Just in case you didn't get enough Jim Garrity on this podcast and Stacey Abrams, you got to go read this piece to learn even more of Jim's reaction to that New York Times piece. And by the way, I realized, and talking about that sick feeling in my stomach after the Titans lost and feeling it, that sick feeling yet again, I was distracted by what was supposed to be my light item, which I went with my brother to see the movie Beast, which I don't highly recommend. It's about a rogue lion that starts attacking people on safari in Africa. Totally implausible and ridiculous. We've seen it all before, whether it's a lion or whether it's an unfrozen dinosaur or whether it's a big crocodile or it's a enormous shark. And really all you want from this movie is the occasional "oh crap" moment when the beast attacks, and you do get that. So, but otherwise, I would see something else if I were you and actually going to a movie theater. So that's it for us. You've been listening to a National Review podcast. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or count this game without the express written permission of National Review Magazine is strictly prohibited. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte, who makes us sound better than we deserve. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Jim. Thanks to NetChoice and Moink. And thanks especially to all of you for listening. We're the editors. We'll see you next time.